Hi. Hi, colleagues, friends, curious people, emerging leaders, confirmed leaders. Welcome to the first part for this two-webinar series, Leadership in Time of Crisis, organized by a small active group from the current cohort of trainings that are following the LIBER program, Emerging Leaders. This is a project launched and coordinated by Najme Shagaye from University Library of Southern Denmark. This webinar provides an opportunity to learn about what other peer leaders are doing and exchange views and learn from each other. Let me introduce myself. My name is Cécile Sviatek. I work in France. I've been a LIBER Leadership Program Working Group member since a few years, and I am delighted to be hosting this first webinar on the topic, thanks to the energy of the Emerging Leaders Program community. Next week, the webinar will be hosted by Katrina Cannon from the same working group, and we welcome you to register for it. You will have all details coming soon. Before we start, as participants are still connecting, let me provide you with some quick information. Please use the link from the chat box in order to open a Slido poll for the shortly coming questions. It's sly.do. Please use the chat box to engage in the general discussion about leadership in times of crisis. Q&A, questions and answers, will be written in the chat box. All questions related to both parts of today's webinar will be answered at the end of the webinar, so please stay with us until the end. And all technical questions can be also put in the chat box and will be answered by Tatiana Yankelievich from the LIBER office. A very special thanks to Tanya, who helped make this webinar come to reality and is here today to manage all logistics. About the webinar recording. The webinar is being fully recorded and it shall be podcasted. You will receive a link maybe tomorrow after this webinar, and the slides will be able on zenodo.org. The Slido results will remain anonymous. They shall be recorded and shared. There won't be a chat recording, but the content, questions, and lively discussions that can happen in the chat will be used anonymously by the Emerging Leaders working group with the purpose of writing an article in LIBER Quarterly. So put all input, all questions in the chat box, and do not hesitate to jump in today's topic. Okay, now that a couple minutes passed, I can see that almost all participants jumped in. Let's start with this webinar. So today, this is the first part of the webinar. And next week, as you can see, there will be a second one. Let me also detail for you this slide. There will be on December the 4th a roundup table about leading and leadership issues in times of COVID-19. So feel free to register and join us. COVID-19 has created a new reality for leaders. They had to address the discomfort and fears caused by the pandemic and think creatively of solutions in the moment of crisis. Research libraries, like other organizations, are facing hard choices around which services to offer to minimize the risk for their staff, communities, business operations. Flexible leaders who can adapt and guide organization and staff offer hope. They build communities. They see new possibilities, and they are needed more than ever. So for this webinar, we will have 4 speakers, 6 more next week. And we shall be hearing first Najme Shagaye and Andrea Tatai that can discover on this slide. I will present you further the two next speakers, Alexandra Everly and Martina Pronk for the second part. Okay, let's start warming up a little with some questions. So please connect to Slido in the attendee chat. The link is provided. Maybe we can put it again. Okay. Slido.com. Here you can see the code. Please connect. I will do the same. And let's answer the first question. Do you have participants a leadership role at your library? Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. This is good to see that we have a lot of leaders today or people who think that they are themselves in a leadership position. And thank you for curious people to be joining this leadership webinar and address those issues with us. And not that we better know who is attending today, let's dig a little deeper with answering the second question, a real question about the library service and leadership challenges. What are the most significant challenges for leaders at research libraries during COVID-19? That's a hard one. Let's take some seconds to fill it in. Wow, there's a big one. Let's take some seconds. If you want to put extra information or to develop this, feel free to put it in the chat box. Well, many thanks to you all for sketching these major issues and questions that leaders have to tackle today in research libraries. So if you want to come back on this later, feel free to do so either in Slido if it stays open or in the chat box. We will stop sharing screen and we will start addressing today's challenging topic of leadership in time of crisis. I now hand over to Najme Shagaye from Thousand Denmark University and Andrea Tatai from Free Universität Berlin, Germany. Dear Najme, since you are the first speaker, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cecile, for introduction. Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good day, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us today. And it's a absolutely privilege for us to have many leaders and colleagues in this webinar today. Thank you so much. As Cecile mentioned, my name is Najme Shagoi, and I'm head of the campus library at University of Southern Denmark, and also member of the LIBER Leadership Working Group. Today, at the first part of webinar, Andrea and I will present the general topic about leadership in time of crisis. I'm quite sure you know about leadership skills, and today we're gonna point some highlighted skills that every leaders need to know during the crisis. First, we need to know what is a good leadership skills in time of crisis or uncertainty. In any crisis, and in these days with pandemic, effective leadership can be a challenge. Inspiring staff, building teams, managing resources, all play part in effective and impactful leadership in the current situation of pandemic for not only research libraries, but also for every organization around the world. During the crisis, many of the traditional roles seems to go out of the window, and as we grapple with the reality of our present situation. To effectively lead in this time, there are a few steps to be followed. Today, we are going to talk about how to be a strong leader first, and then we talk also about setting a strategy up for our libraries, how to be a realistic leader, know about the leverage continuous learning and development among teams, what is the communication strategy for us, and also how to keep our teams focused and productive. So let's start with sorry, just yes, I'm sorry for that. There are lots of skills that each leader should consider to act as a strong leader. Here I can point some of those. Our staff, our users, suppliers, stakeholders will look at us as a leader to project a sense of calm through this difficult, uncertain situation. They look to leaders to be calm and deliberate in their decision and actions. Leaders who react to any event with stress and in highly emotional ways, for sure they will add stress and anxiety among teams. Therefore, we need to know how to be calm. Also, we must be calm, but not still water calm. When we exhibit confidence, we are typically happy. We feel positive about our ability to lead the team, and also we deal better with the challenges. We need to demonstrate as well sincere appreciation for the professional and personal challenges our teams are going through. It's important to ensure our teams have support on not only running their jobs in a positive and forward-looking manner, but also counseling for mental and emotional well-being. And finally here, strong leaders to get ahead of changing circumstances. Leaders seek input and information from diverse sources. We should not be afraid to admit what we don't know. We are not going to know all the answers. This is a time for us to call on the resources, the capabilities of all our team's members, and also the leadership team in the organization, and bring them all together in task forces, in sub-task forces, and have everyone potentially given a role in which they feel they can be contributing to overcoming this uncertainty and crisis. Yes, what are the strategy in this situation? I'm not going to go deep into the topic because my colleagues in second part of this talk today, they're gonna mention in the detail about the strategy. Just three general points here. Many leaders adopted the stop and start mentality, asking what do we have to stop doing and what do we need to start doing again. We need to restructure our strategy and perhaps mission and vision of the library for some years ahead. Over the next few years, we will spend more time and money developing our online services to library users. Therefore, we need to develop new strategy for negotiating better deals for e-resources, for digital archives, for special collection, for recalibrate our services desk to virtual way, and also, of course, supporting online teaching and research. Also, the economic impact will be felt for years to come. Libraries, like other organizations, struggle to maintain enrollment and will confront budget reduction and also hiring freezes and other spending restrictions. How we will do more to provide greater online services. We will need streamlined workflows and retrain existing employees to fill new roles. And in order to keep pace with technological advancements and changes in the global economy, leaders may need to work with their teams to upskill and reskill and find ways to collaborate with artificial intelligence to protect the intellectual freedom for our users. Now I hand over to Andrea and will back to you again in a minute.
Thank you, Najme. Hello, everyone. I'm going to continue what good leadership could look like with two aspects: being realistic and the leverage of continuous learning. Being realistic as a leader in times of crisis is certainly a key qualification and builds on a good knowledge of your own resources. I would like to address three aspects I consider to be particularly important: the personal capacities, the setting of goals, and the anticipating of the future. Being realistic in terms of employees means not only having a feeling for the situation quantitatively, so do I have enough people, but above all, qualitatively, knowing exactly where you stand with regard to the willingness of your people to keep going on. Is there inner resignation? Or is there sufficient resilience, patience, mental strength? In times of crisis, goals are more than usual a matter of negotiation and consideration. We had to set priorities in our services, for example. Which books needed to be made available first? Which part of our libraries could we make accessible for on-site use? Which additional services were possible, like using the copy machines? In a mindful, balancing way, and in small steps with good interim solutions, we try to get close to the services of pre-corona times. We gradually increased opening hours in the area of tension between the expectations of users and the university management, and personal capacities and hygiene considerations. We also discussed things we did not want to do in order to avoid getting hung up in details like disinfect tables or quarantine books. Looking realistically into the future, especially the near future, also means keeping an eye on how the environment is changing and being prepared for different scenarios. In accordance with the Coronavirus Situation Report of Berlin, which you can see here on the slide, and resulting measures for the universities, we propose service scenarios to the university board. In the same way, we planned the situation for the most negative scenario, another shutdown. In her book, Never Saw It Coming, the American sociologist Karen Nerullo examines how difficult it is for individuals and organizations to expect negative events and developments. She points out that it is sometimes extremely helpful to anticipate the worst case and give two examples of successful defeatism: the anticipation of possible computer problems at the beginning of the new millennium, and the successful containment of the first SARS epidemic in 2002 and 3. So don't be afraid to be a warrior sometimes. The second part of my contribution deals with the impact of the coronavirus crisis on our own learning. This can be considered both in an organizational way and individually. I want to highlight a few aspects. An interesting question is how an organization can learn from the crisis situation. How have social interactions changed, and what is the gain? And finally, a few thoughts about dealing with uncertainties and fears. An interesting approach to organizational learning and crisis comes from Philip Schaller and Arjan Kosika. They said, with COVID-19, we're witnessing a real experiment right now that involves the entire society. We are experimenting with solutions, and as a consequence, we are learning. Experiments help to mobilize potential and hidden energies. They expose thought blockades and refute standards and dogmas. Viewing the crisis as an experiment makes it easier to look at it with the distant eye of a scientist. It helps to structure the procedure a little bit and not just let it happen. The author's advice: keep your eyes open and see things that you did not expect. So I started looking for the unexpected, and I observed people feel comfortable with agile working, for example, switching between on-site and home office. The increased opportunities to choose one's place of work gives greater value to meeting with colleagues on site. People appreciate the gathering, the small random talk at the open office door. Since wearing masks contributes to alienation, we looked for ways to create encounters without masks, and we discovered the outside. We meet at park benches and we enjoy a walk to work. We will keep these good habits also in post-corona times, that's for sure. Now I come to my final point, dealing with uncertainty and fears. We have already become quite used to accepting the unplannability to a certain extent. We have, after 8 months, adapted to the situation, and it is important to be aware of this. We have experienced that an attitude of "you are needed" is helpful to cope better with fears and worries, and indeed, we get so much positive and grateful feedback from our students and scientists to be sure that this is not a fake slogan. Libraries have so far been regarded as safe places. No super spreader events so far, good distance and hygiene rules. We keep telling this ourselves and our users so that libraries hopefully remain safe havens for learning and studying. Let me conclude with a quote from Anton Chekhov, that in the end there is no certainty, only different levels of uncertainty. And with this, I pass back to Najmi. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, next Monday, as Cecile mentioned, in our second webinar, you will hear fully about communication strategy and also communication channels. But here is only brief about the communication strategy. With a strong set of communication strategy, our teams will be able to focus on executing the action that lead to the greatest impact. What leaders need to consider is to know, what do our team members feeling? They should know that we are all same in this situation and nobody is alone. They should trust in our library, in our purpose, the library purpose, and also the potential. And also they need to be confident in the library's leadership and its ability to manage risks. And not only feeling, but also we want to communicate to achieve the goals. We emphasize continuity with a shared past and with the shared values that won't change during the situation. We provide clarity as the situation evolves, keeping staff informed and putting updates in proper context. And we set a realistic expectation for the future so staff can be prepared mentally, financially, and emotionally. And of course, we make sure that they understand the actions that we want to drive in post-COVID. So let's just have a very short and brief experience from our library at University of Southern Denmark. At our library, from first phase of lockdown, leadership team tried to focus on 3 task force to keep our teams focused and productive, and we will still continue with that. Like many other organizations around the world, we have staff who are depending upon us, those who are not resilient enough, those who have lost childcare arrangements and need to establish their new normal, or someone who has elderly parents who are in fragile state of health. So they are going to be double concerned about their relatives. Therefore, if they want time off or working out of normal working hours, or even need to have a little bit space to look after their family, we consider giving that to them. So we continue being flexible for a while, going forward until people get their back to the feet. Also, for many people, connection with the colleagues can provide an important buffer to their feelings of social isolation and disconnection, especially when they are working from home. It's important to routinely check in not only about the work, but also to see how staff are doing. In this regard, we have established online coffee meetings among teams routinely happen, and also we had many social activities online or physically have been organized for them at the entire library, such as playing online game. We had very fun time with the playing game online, and also we had the walking in the nature with limited number of staff according to the government restriction in Denmark. And also we call it walk and talk, which is really fun. And also we had lots of different workouts and movements online and physically. We had online yoga, we had karate with our library director as well, and many things that which are absolutely crucial as staff grapple with the anxiety and burnout. We keep doing all to provide the sense of well-being and strength team spirit and creates more confidence. And last but not least, recently in our library, a group of leaders by chairing by the library director has established anti-corona task force, where we connected and adapted a model for all our services to our users and also work related for our staff. This model is designed in a complex mind map to identify which services and tasks need to be considered and handled either in a pandemic situation or for post-COVID. We work constantly within this group to strive efficient service and human care in our library. Thank you so much for listening me, and now I hand over to the group for next part.
Thank you, dear Najme. Thank you, Andrea, for addressing this very challenging topic. Thank you all for what you put on the Slido. I reminded it in the chat box. Yes, a big applause for you. All Q&A written in the chat, all questions related to both parts will be dealt with at the end of this webinar. And I recall you that all input in Slido or in chat box can be used anonymously for the purpose of writing an article in LIBER Quarterly by the Emerging Leader Task Force. To continue this webinar, we shall now be addressing the crucial topic of how we can realign our strategies and how we communicate our values with Martin de Pronk from Utrecht in the Netherlands and Alexandra Evely from Wellcome Collection in the UK during this second part. 2 questions will be asked to the participants, also to collect feedback directly in the chat. They will be written by Tanya, many thanks to her again, at the moment when they will be asked by the speakers. Dear Alexandra, since you are the first speaker to address the issues of realigning our strategies, communicating our values, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Cecile, and good afternoon, everybody. I guess in more ordinary times, it wouldn't be a surprise to have a section on strategy in a leadership webinar, but no doubt it would focus more on the longer term, on establishing a clear vision and plan of action for the library over a period of around 3 to 5 years. So that's according to the first of the dictionary definitions on this slide. So at our Emerging Leaders programme before the 2019 LIBER conference in Dublin, for example, we discussed strategic planning as something which, as library leaders, we anticipated to require both time and space. So we talked about creating a conducive environment for review and reflection, planning ahead to create opportunities for consultation, communication and engagement, ensuring alignment between library strategy and that of the wider university or some other governing body. I'd argue that we're accustomed as well to thinking of strategy primarily in terms of its outputs and its standard measures. So typically there's some kind of hierarchy or policy and planning documents, carefully crafted objectives and key performance indicators. And change in this context is generally incremental and gradual. Progress is carefully monitored, success is structurally embedded. Then came March 2020, and research libraries all over Europe, indeed across most of the world, of course, were suddenly required to close their doors and suspend most or all of their on-site services. And this abrupt switch into rapid response mode in the face of a global health emergency initially seemed to cast out these rather leisurely notions of strategy altogether. So whole sections of our strategic planning documents and associated KPIs were rendered suddenly inconsequential. I mean, who has the capacity to lead a collaborative revision of collections development policy when students are struggling to access basic texts? How relevant are the library user satisfaction survey results when the library study spaces are inaccessible? But now, after 8 months of COVID restrictions, it's evident that the pandemic will continue to impact for a considerable period to come on how our libraries can operate and the services we're able to deliver. And consequently, that we can't remain in this crisis mode forever. We must begin again to think ahead and to think ahead realistically, as Andrea mentioned, and begin to realign library ambitions to this uncertain new operating environment. And so, as the second dictionary definition on this slide highlights, strategic planning isn't actually a concept alien to a crisis setting. In fact, the English word strategy derives directly from an ancient Greek word for general or the leader of an army, and it's commonly used in a warfare setting. It's this definition of strategy as process, the art of planning, that we're interested in today. An art of planning that needs to evolve quickly in response to the changing environment, enabling leaders to capitalize rather than capitulate to formidable challenges as they arise. So, how can the research library strategy respond flexibly and positively to the coronavirus crisis? And if so, how? So in the second part of the webinar, Martina and I want to explore how COVID might change and shape research library strategy in the future. Are library strategic goals actually still broadly relevant and fit for purpose? And if so, how best can we move the form of library strategy away from the customary measured progression to a more dynamic configuration which stands up to an environment of rapid and disruptive change, and which helps us make the most of any fleeting opportunities for success? Or are there ways in which we might turn the disruption to day-to-day services into an opportunity for a more radical redesign of the library and its mission? And we're really interested in your experiences here too and your views. Do you see this crisis as a temporary situation that you're just sitting out until you're back to something like business as usual? Or do you agree with us that coronavirus has become the catalyst for significant long-term change? On the slide now is an open-ended question about this for you to consider whilst we talk. We'd be really grateful if you put any good examples in the chat so that we can analyse your responses after the webinar. We're really interested in any examples of strategic discussions that might have taken place at your library over the last few months. For example, have you been involved in scenario planning exercises or applied existing library strategy to determine priorities for reopening library buildings? Are you using COVID-19 as a vehicle for driving already planned changes or driving already planned changes further or faster? Have new strategic goals emerged or existing ones come into increased prominence as a consequence of the pandemic? So fundamentally, we're curious to know whether existing strategies have influenced research libraries' responses to the coronavirus crisis and in what ways, and what we can learn from the past 8 months that might affect how library strategy develops in future. Now, if strategy is the formula that helps an organisation deliver its mission, then values are the constant in that equation. Values are what we want to retain or what we want to ensure we don't lose sight of even at this time of crisis. So what is it really important to keep? This begs the question though, what are our constants or our library values? And it turns out there are actually quite a lot of options from which we might choose. So there are sectoral principles such as fair or open access. Possibly the professional values of librarianship are relevant, as expressed on this slide in the rather long list from the American Library Association. Sometimes organisations, including my own, also aspire to certain stated values, and I've included 2 library-specific examples on this slide. And LIBER is another such organisation which explicitly claims to be values-led, in this case, the values of collaboration and inclusivity. So another question for our audience then. What values are important to you and to your library? Again, we'd be really interested in your examples of how values are promoted and communicated through library strategy, but also in examples of the opposite, where a summer of crisis has challenged our belief in the role of a library in upholding some of these values. For example, how has the Black Lives Matter movement exposed bias in previous strategic priorities around collections access and the inclusivity of the services we offer to our users? Or if, for instance, we make a strategic decision to focus exclusively on enhanced digital services whilst buildings remain inaccessible due to coronavirus, who does this effectively exclude from library services? How confident are we about what truly matters to us as library leaders, and how do we ensure we stay true to those values and principles whilst leading our libraries through a period of profound social and psychological trauma? And now I will hand over to Martina.
Yes, thank you, Alexandra. So, there it is. Strategy as a process, the art of planning that needs to evolve quickly in response to a changing environment, that enables leaders to capitalize rather than capitulate to formidable challenges as they arise. In the next part of our presentation, we would like to explore the possible impact of the past 8 months on how libraries might want to alter their strategies and be viable and face upcoming challenges. In many cases, entire campuses were closed, and in addition to no longer being able to use the physical location, libraries could primarily run only their digital services. Now, apart from all the troubles COVID-19 gave us, could this perhaps be seen as a real-life lab situation for what the world of research libraries would look like when research output in all its different forms and library services would be fully digital? What do we learn from this pandemic, and how can we apply changes in our strategies? Changes that maybe, or perhaps for certain, will be accelerated by this crisis. As Alexandra presented earlier, the values of the library itself are not necessarily at stake here. Having only digital channels at our disposal, the COVID pandemic gave us the exceptional opportunity to rethink the form in which we want, or rather need to shape our services, anticipating a digital shift. Making a shift to a digital world means that form will need to change rather than our values. An interesting read in this respect is the Manifesto for the Digital Shift in Research Libraries that Research Libraries UK presented earlier this year. The link will be placed in the chat. It describes the vision that was confirmed by the unprecedented transformation the COVID-19 pandemic caused for research libraries all over the world. Now, first I would like to take a sidestep to Simon Sinek, amongst others, creator of the golden circle of why, how, and what. And if we would start with why, then in my own words, I would say, for instance, that we as research libraries believe that everyone should have access to knowledge and information. And how do we do that? Well, by making it findable, accessible, standardized or interoperable, and usable or maybe reusable. And now it becomes interesting. Because for centuries, the answer to what we did to achieve that was that we built impressive buildings and put our collections on shelves and lent them to people that somehow were allowed access to them. But in a digital or even open access world with technologies that allow us to share knowledge and information easily with the whole world, do we, and for the argument I do generalize here, still need those shelves? If we hold on to our values and how we want to operationalize them, our why and how, then what would our services look like in a digitized world? And what strategies do we need to get there? Before we get to possible consequences for our strategies, let us share a few observations that we discussed in our group of library leaders that are participating in this year's LIBER Emerging Leaders program. Of course, libraries were completely or to a large extent dependent on their digital collections. And suddenly it became apparent that digitized collections represented priorities identified in the recent past, including possible bias. Publishers made COVID-related research papers open access available, and we saw cases where other activities got priority within our universities, and library spaces were used, for instance, for medical purposes or COVID research groups. Consultative services on, for instance, copyright, open access publishing, research data management, with already a strong online presence, they flourished. And colleagues with digital skills were easily able to adjust, not only to working in a digital environment themselves, but also to transform existing services into a new digital format. These observations underline that this might be a foresight of what the world would look like while being mainly digital. Now, libraries for decades have acknowledged the disruptive impact of digital technologies on our societies. But somehow the response of libraries so far seems to resemble the famous pan filled with water and frogs slowly bringing to boil. But when COVID-19 hit the fans, I would be curious to hear which of you felt more like the pan already boiling and we, as cute little frogs, were being thrown into it. Although it might have frightened you, it may also have shown you a momentum to change. When looking beyond the immediate in order to shape current and future practice and priorities, there are several long-term changes that may be accelerated by this crisis, like we present on the slide. However, new developments can only take place when time and budget can be allocated for this purpose. If libraries want to make this shift, are they prepared for this purpose? Are they prepared to make tough decisions? And should we rethink the investments we make? Are we prepared to decrease investments in more traditional services in favor of new ones being fit to a digital world? And what does this mean when many research libraries are facing budget cuts due to the impact on our economies the COVID-19 pandemic is causing? To further explore what a shift into digital world might look like, I would like to share an example of my own library with you. Already in 2012, Utrecht University Library launched the ambitious and ground-shaking vision of a library without a catalogue. A vision based on the idea that in 2030, information and knowledge will be open access available and collections held by libraries would represent a relatively small percentage of the total scholarly output as a whole. On the slide are the most important strategies our library took to make this shift. The impact on our organization is huge, not only on our staff that needs to be able to deal with constant change, but also on how we work together. We need to build a culture that facilitates change and innovation. This couldn't be done on top of the traditional library services. To stay within budgets and even anticipate a decreasing workforce, the library decided to provide more efficiency in our traditional services, like letting go of local search options, to make room for new developments. So how did we do during COVID-19 in delivering our services? That's an interesting question, of course. Well, in general, it can be said that the scenario we saw for 2030 did point us in the right direction. Having to rely completely on digital services, though, gave us the urgency to no longer linger what we did, but get into immediate action. And one example, for instance, was that this meant that within a few weeks, all our workshops were transformed to online versions. Of course, our strategies were never meant for a situation like a pandemic we experienced the past few months, and we are far from there yet. But we believe it did help us to work towards a world that will be digital and even open access. Now, there's one other aspect to consider. Because if you would ask anyone, anywhere in the world, what a library is, you probably would get a somewhat similar answer, like the library is a house of knowledge, full of books, and where you can peacefully read or study. That image is not really helping us when making a shift towards a library operating in a digital world. I would be very curious how many of you got requests from your boards or student representatives to please transform those research data management or reproducible coding workshops into online versions. But to be honest, I guess most universities were focusing on collections and study spots. At least mine was. And that brings us to our final thoughts on the impact of changing our strategies on how to communicate our values. Alexandra, back to you.
So our argument then is that it's in order to make such tough decisions that library leaders need to hold and to communicate a really strong view of library values as the constant around which the future library is shaped. So are we still able to convey the value of the library to our users when our strategy no longer assumes a physical space full of books and quiet study spaces? Are the academic community even aware that the library is already providing the resources needed for teaching in online learning environments, running digital skills workshops, or supporting research data management services? So back to Martine's observation that during the initial lockdown period, even at her digital first university, there was a disproportionate demand to know how access to study spots and physical collections would be maintained, whereas no one was really concerned to check that access to online collections and services would continue unchanged. So as we look towards the second webinar in this series then, our response to what do we keep is that we would want to keep and develop a better shared understanding not of what a library does, but why this is important, to advocate for added value that the library provides as a valued partner in both teaching and research. Earlier, I referred to the need for library strategy to be agile, to withstand sudden and disruptive change, and to enable library leaders to grasp and respond in real time to transitory opportunities for longer-term success. The pandemic certainly delivered just such a sharp shock to the system. But it's also helped us to demonstrate how libraries can adapt quickly in challenging times. So is this our moment then? Is this our opportunity to grasp the nettle and define and determine a radically transformed, collaborative and inclusive library future? So will our emerging libraries leaders, colleagues agree with us about the new challenge of communicating the library purpose and value? Sign up for part 2 of this webinar series to find out. But for now, I will close with a final request to please let us have any examples of either strategy shifts or firmly held values at your library, and finally, hand you back to our host for questions.
Well, thank you. If everyone can come on stage now, we can have some questions during those 10 minutes. I can see that some people are putting input in the chat box. Many thanks. Maybe you want to ask one question, please put it in the chat box with an @ if you direct your question to someone specifically. Otherwise, it can be a roundtable question. But since, as always, when we ask participants, do you have questions? Of course they don't. They are just processing what they heard. So I can start with the first question, and then we will see if other people will join the Q&A. My first question would be to Najme, because you pointed out the way of collaborating with artificial intelligence as part of library strategies. And I don't know much about this. And could you tell us how it applies, for example, in your library, if you have an example to share?
Actually, not example in our library, but we are considered that. Under these circumstances with the pandemic and also for the post-COVID, we all do believe that the education has been changed and also more changes is coming. So therefore, the status of the library services as a social education, learning center, knowledge center, and the communication center will be more important under the impact of the artificial intelligence. It will help us to increase our library services in digital way. Let's have some example. Imagine how helpful the use of robots would be in the library in a contactless society. Now we have just to make a distance between each other. So maybe robot can help us, or machine learning, for example, to improve the library metadata generation. Or we are thinking also maybe the intelligent interface to online databases as well would be helpful. So I think they are something that needs to be considered in the strategy for the library.
Okay, thank you. Anyone working on artificial intelligence, if you want to complete what has just been said? Otherwise, we can jump to the attendee chat. While I can see a comment from Heli Kautonen. Hello, Heli. Maybe we can develop the question or add extra information. Heli writes, for many libraries, COVID-19 has shown the importance of electronic services, accelerated the transformation to 100% digital. However, during the complete lockdown, at her library, customers cried mostly after the printed books. Her strategic conclusion, and you may react to this, is that COVID-19 may help us libraries differentiate our service profiles. So anyone want to react on this?
Yeah, shall I answer or give a response to this question? Thank you, Heli. I think you're absolutely right. This is what my university, what I recognize, that especially from certain disciplines, there was a huge cry for the physical collections. What we tried to express was in a digital world where more and more output will be in a digital form, the amount of physical output will be relatively smaller and smaller. So what will that do to your strategy from the library in how to answer that challenge? And what will happen in the future? That would be, I totally agree with Helly that this was absolutely the case during the pandemic.
I could possibly just add to that as well. I should explain that the library that I work for is primarily a special collections library. And it was really what I was thinking about when I alluded to previous strategic decisions having affected what is available now and what will be available in the future. The fact that for 8 months we've primarily only been able to make material available online has really highlighted bias in previous decisions around digitization, but also in some cases around what was catalogued in the first place. So typically our collections of materials that relate to other cultures, they're often in languages that aren't English, and so they have been deprioritized for cataloguing, and then they've been deprioritized again for digitization. I think certainly our digitization strategy will shift significantly in future in order to be able to address that.
Any other comment, or I can take the next question or comment to react on? There was a comment by Patricia, and she says that we have they have some values in their strategy: openness, inclusion, collaboration, and partnership. And she specifies, in the COVID area, these values are still pertinent. Openness and inclusion speak to the Black Lives Matter movement and greater public engagement. Collaboration and partnership within the university has helped to highlight how important the library is for remote education. So maybe this is for Alexandra. You said Black Lives Matter has exposed bias in previous strategic priorities around collection access. Can you give examples or develop on this?
One was the example I've just talked through, but also my organisation has colonial era origins. A lot of our legacy collections were collected in the period between the two world wars, and what you might say was the height of the British Empire. We want to be very transparent about our origins, and I guess the same would be the case for a lot of universities, not just an organisation like mine. But it's been really tough to do that because of the decisions that have been taken in the past about management of the collections and what we know about the origins of some of the older material that we hold. So that would be one example. We also have taken inclusion very seriously in terms of thinking about reopening services, on-site services to the public. And every decision that we take about services as they reopen to the public has been checked against a checklist, an inclusion checklist, to make sure that we are not inadvertently excluding some people that otherwise we would want to encourage to use our services.
As we go over, we have many questions coming in, so I'm answering every attendee that asked the question. From time to time, we have a few minutes left. If you have some extra minutes, maybe we can dig deeper in some other Q&A. But we have a question or a comment about copyright and sustainable knowledge development. Peter says that 100% digital does not always exist. Right. Less than 30% of their reading list books is not available. They're in electronic format. Can we address copyright with strategies and leadership issues? Some are muted. Or did you put in your strategic priorities actions about, yes, Martina?
Yeah, maybe I can elaborate a little bit further on the Dutch situation compared maybe to other countries, because what we experience in Utrecht, we focus as a research library, which means that students basically have the responsibility to cater for their own study materials, which might be different from other countries where libraries are supposed to have textbooks available for students and learning materials as well. So that might be a difference in getting closer to the 100% digital in the Netherlands, maybe than some other countries. That might be a difference. And what we experience is that really textbooks, because then you also get to the budget question. Textbooks and learning materials very often are much more expensive. Uh, that's just the business model of publishers, I guess. So it might be budget-wise much harder to get to the 100% e-content for that matter as well. So that would be my one of my comments, my thoughts on this topic.
Well, we have another question, maybe for Andrea. How do you think libraries have survived this month of COVID compared to other university services? Well, let's keep on the leadership aspect of it, and then we'll have one or two extra questions and jump to conclusion.
Yeah, it's a very good question from Nuria, but I'm not sure because I don't have a good overview about the other university services. Perhaps Nuria could tell a little bit more in detail what she means. As far as I know, libraries are the most important departments of our library, and even if the university is going in a and what do they call it during the winter time between Christmas and New Year, the whole university shuts down in order to save energy, but only the libraries, they are allowed to stay open until Christmas, because this year the university will close down much earlier than in the other years. Only the libraries will be there, so you can see how important for the whole university the library services are.
Any other comment, or should we jump to the last question so we don't end too late? No? Let's jump to Peter, supported by Emma. Peter says, oh, that's a big question. A library without a catalogue. Because what an individual library holds in very small proportion of the information available. What a question. There seems to be a profound implication for not having a collection in the library at all. Please, panelists, comment before we say goodbye.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I have to answer this one. Yeah, this is huge implication for the library. A library without a catalog is basically taking the heart out of the library, or the library as it was. And for a long time, we in Utrecht felt like the silly ones in Europe, or maybe in the world, for having a vision of a library without a catalog. So I was really pleased to read in the manifesto for a digital shift in research libraries that Research Library UK presented earlier this year, that they were discussing and challenging the catalogs as well. Yeah, it is the library, and what you own as a library is at the heart of the library. But that's why I think it is so important to think about if we would make a shift to that digital world. And I don't think it's a matter of if, but when, rather. Then we need to think about what are the implications for our library if we do not have a huge collection anymore, and we don't have to invite people to come to our buildings, and that's where all the knowledge is, because I think we've passed that era already a long time ago with the invention of the internet. So yeah, I think we as libraries really should think about this huge question and how we would want to deal with this in the near future. And I think that is the takeaway from COVID-19. What happens if we go all digital, and what does that really mean for us? Thanks.
And just to follow up on that, the answer from my perspective is all around boundaries and values. So in the past, I think the boundaries of the library have been very clear. They've been physically demarcated. And as Martina says, we've probably already moved beyond that point. So what is it that we as libraries feel that we bring, which is not available from Google, say? As an information provider, what is the added value that the library provides, and how do we advocate for something that is not physically tangible in the way that books on shelves are?
Well, thank you all, and thank you for the continuous learning and being realistic issues. This sense of reality seems to be more important in time of crisis, so let's see how this can be sharpened, especially today. Thank you, everyone. As I put in the chat and Tanya just say it, thank you for your attendance and participation. Please register for the next event, so webinar next week, and on December the 4th, the panel discussion, Research Libraries and COVID-19 Impact and Plans for the Future, that will present the results of the LIBER COVID-19 survey that just ended. That will tackle the issue of how European Research Library responded to COVID-19 and how effectively we plan all for the future through collaborative measures. Thank you all. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, gentlemen. And back to business now. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.